The Kansas legislature has reached the end of the first week of the 2018 session. Of course, this session began on Monday, and then we went into Tuesday where the governor gave his State of the State address. That's a traditional thing he usually does on the first or second day of the session. This year, the governor kind of outlined some of his budget proposals for the year. Now, it was kind of interesting going into the beginning of the session here because we weren't really sure who's going to deliver the State of the State address. As you know, the governor has been appointed to an ambassadorship by the president, still waiting on confirmation. He's been reappointed to that after that not happening in the towards the end of the congressional session. But nonetheless, the governor did deliver the State of the State. Probably the most surprising thing was the fact that he talked about responding to the Gannon versus State of Kansas lawsuit by indicating he'd like to see $600 million additional funding to go into K-12 education. And of course, that proposal calls for doing that over a 5-year period. Now, there's people that were happy with that, some were not. The fact of the matter is, it's all up to the court whether or not they'll accept that kind of a proposal. Some people were looking at possibly doing that over 3 years. Now, one of the things that I think is notable about this session is that when we went into the session, we were a lot better positioned than we were last year. If you recall, we came into that session with a $900 million shortfall. So because of our actions towards the end of last session, by reversing the governor's 2012 tax plan, we saw our revenues increase. In fact, we were ahead of estimates probably for the last 5 or 6 months, which the state has not seen that in quite a long time. What happens there is that we still have 3 reporting periods. We have to come up with something for the Supreme Court probably by the end of April. We are already ahead of last year at this time, and especially even since the month of July, we've seen our revenues grow quite a bit. We have seen growth in sales tax by about 3.6%, and of course our corporate taxes were pretty much flat for the last few years, and that was a growth of about 25% in that area. Other things in the governor's plan is that he's calling for probably additional spending in 2018 as well as 2019. I think that's what's kind of gotten some pushback, especially from the Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House. He's calling for about $35.5 million in new spending for fiscal year 2018 and $290 million increased spending for 2019. Some people are questioning whether it's doable. Interestingly enough, the day after the State of the State, which was your typical State of the State address in that there wasn't a lot of details, just kind of some proposals. As a member of the House Appropriations Committee, we did hear from the governor's budget director the following day where he tried to at least point out some of the details. On the other hand, he didn't really tell how they were paying for things. So I talked about the increased spending and so forth. When questioned about that, it was interesting that his comeback was that they were betting on increased revenues. So obviously we're seeing those, and whether or not the court's going to accept even a multi-year plan, I suspect they will, especially if they can retain jurisdiction, and we do, pretty much give them a good faith effort as far as a mapped out plan. Now, we did have a special committee on education that was looking at this whole issue during the interim period or the non-session time, and I'm not sure that, in my opinion, they took the right direction. They spent a lot of time talking about how to, I guess, more or less diminish the role of the Supreme Court in this. Now, bear in mind, the Supreme Court is an appellate court, so they're just doing their job. We are, as I mentioned, the end of the first week. Activity was a little bit slow as far as the committees go. Next week, we should see that ramp up a little bit, especially your budget committees. I serve on the Higher Education Budget Committee, so at some point we'll start hearing testimony from like the Regents institutions and other entities that are covered in our budget committee. And so until then, we're out of session here on Monday due to the Martin Luther King observance. So we'll be back here on Tuesday, and hopefully we'll get to work and see a lot of committee activity. I will say that spirit of collaboration and so forth seems to be there again this session like it was last year. And I think people came back here knowing that we had, a good session last year, and I think they're ready to get back to work. So next time, the next report, Hopefully I'll have a little bit more on the details as they come forth, and then we get some clarification on it. Until then, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.